Moscow, February 1991. Deep within the Soviet Ministry of Defense, a crisis meeting was underway. Winter frost clung to the windows. But inside the stuffy briefing room, something far more chilling was happening. The generals gathered around the conference table weren't discussing the crumbling Soviet economy or the restless Baltic republics. Their attention was riveted on a stack of urgent telexes from Baghdad, each one more alarming than the last. For 40 years, Soviet military doctrine had rested on a single immovable pillar: overwhelming, armored superiority. Thousands of tanks, protected by layered air defense systems, would roll across any battlefield like an unstoppable tide. They had exported this philosophy to Iraq, building what was then the world's fourth largest military machine. The Iraqi army possessed over 1,000 T-72 tanks, Soviet-designed ZSU-234 Shilka radar-guided anti-aircraft vehicles, and batteries of surface-to-air missiles. On paper, it was a fortress designed to bleed any attacker white. But the reports streaming in from Kuwait described something impossible. The first transmission came from a Republican Guard tank commander positioned along the Saudi border. His voice crackled with confusion. Then terror. His column of T-72 tanks was being systematically destroyed. But not by cruise missiles or high-altitude stealth bombers. Something was circling overhead, low and slow, hunting them like prey. "We engaged with everything," the commander reported. "The Shilkas fired thousands of rounds. We saw impacts on the aircraft. We saw pieces fall off. But it kept flying. It turned around and killed us." In Moscow, the intelligence officers exchanged troubled glances. Modern aircraft don't survive direct hits. From 23mm cannon fire, they disintegrate. They explode. They fall. Yet, this thing refused to die. More reports followed, each one stranger than the last. An Iraqi gunner swore he watched his SA-16 missile strike an American aircraft dead center. The radar track showed the target losing altitude, bleeding speed, shedding debris. By every metric, it should have been a kill. 2 minutes later, that same aircraft was still flying, limping south toward Saudi Arabia at low altitude. The intercepted radio chatter revealed no panic, no frantic ejection call, just a calm American voice. Lost PC-1 and PC-2. Manual reversion active. Heading home. Manual reversion. The Soviet translators stopped. That couldn't be right. In the age of fly-by-wire systems, where computers make thousands of adjustments per second to keep unstable jets airborne, manual reversion was an anachronism. It meant flying with cables and pulleys, using raw muscle to move control surfaces against the screaming wind. It was impossible to fly a multi-ton jet that way, unless the Americans had built something fundamentally different. The mystery deepened when Iraqi forces reported the sound, not the whistle of a missile or the roar of afterburners, but something primal and terrifying, a deep, resonant BRRRRRT that made tank hulls vibrate from miles away. After that sound came death. 72 tanks, designed to withstand NATO anti-tank rounds, were being opened like sardine cans. Soviet military advisors in Iraq found the wrecks and couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. The entry wounds weren't from high-explosive missiles. They were punctures. Clean holes punched straight through composite armor that should have been impenetrable. Not one hole, not two, but dozens, grouped so tightly they formed a pattern like a sewing machine had stitched across the tank's hull. Whatever hit these machines went through the armor, through the crew compartment, through the engine block, and out the backside. One Soviet colonel examined a destroyed T-72 and calculated the angle of attack. The aircraft had flown straight at the tank, slow enough and low enough that every gunner on the ground should have shredded it. This defied every principle of modern warfare. To deliver this pattern of destruction, you had to be predictable, vulnerable, suicidal, and it worked. The Iraqi soldiers had a name for it now. Some called it the Whispering Death. Others simply called it the Cross, for its distinctive silhouette against the smoke-filled sky. They claimed they hit it with everything they had. One unit reported scoring a direct hit with an Igla missile, the Soviet answer to the American Stinger. The aircraft trailed smoke. Pieces fell away, but it kept flying, kept circling, kept firing that demonic cannon. The KGB Technical Directorate began pulling files frantically. They found references to an American program from the 1970 seconds called AX. The resulting aircraft was designated A-10 Thunderbolt II. Soviet analysts had dismissed it years ago. It was subsonic, maxing out at around 420 miles per hour. It had no sophisticated radar system. It looked like a mutant dragonfly with engines bolted awkwardly to its tail. The wings were straight and thick, reminiscent of World War II designs rather than the swept, elegant lines of modern jets. Even the U.S. Air Force had tried to retire it multiple times, preferring sleek F-16 fighters and sophisticated multi-role aircraft. The Soviet assessment from the 1,980 seconds was clear and dismissive. In a high-intensity conflict against modern air defenses, the A-10 would have a life expectancy measured in minutes. It was a relic, a target, not a threat. So why were the T-72 tanks burning? As more intelligence poured in, the Soviets began to piece together the scope of their miscalculation. One intercept particularly captured their attention. It detailed a single aircraft, call sign Sandy, operating deep behind enemy lines during a search and rescue mission. The pilot flew deliberately into a concentration of anti-aircraft fire to protect a downed comrade. The amount of ordnance in the air was described in the intercept as a wall of steel. No rational pilot would enter that airspace. It was suicide. But the pilot entered anyway, circled for over 30 minutes, engaged multiple targets, and flew out. The aircraft took critical damage. The hydraulics were shot out. Flight controls were severed. Half the tail was missing. By all rights. The laws of aerodynamics demanded that the plane spin into the ground. The pilots of Soviet Mi-23 seconds or Mi-25 seconds would have ejected minutes ago. But the radar tracks showed the Sandy flight still airborne, still controlled, limping back to base on manual reversion. The Soviets were watching a technological impossibility unfold in real time. They needed to know how this was possible. They needed to know why their weapons, designed to kill sleek fighters like the F-16 or F-15, were bouncing off this flying tank. The order went out from Moscow to the KGB residence in Baghdad. Find out what that aircraft is made of. Find out why it doesn't die. And bring us the wreckage. But the Americans, it turned out, had started with a different question entirely. While Soviet designers began with the airframe and added weapons, the Americans began with a gun. The GAU-8 Avenger wasn't a machine gun. It was artillery that happened to fly. 7 rotating barrels, each 9.6 inches long, spinning at rates that could reach 3 now sense rounds per minute. The cannon itself weighed 620 pounds. The complete gun system, including the ammunition, drum, and feed mechanism, weighed over 4,000 pounds, representing roughly 16% of the entire aircraft's empty weight. The ammunition drum alone was 3 feet in diameter. When maintenance crews removed the gun for inspection, they had to place a jack under the aircraft's tail to prevent it from tipping backward. The gun was so heavy, so dominant, that it defined the aircraft's center of gravity. The ammunition wasn't lead or even tungsten. It was depleted uranium, a byproduct of nuclear fuel enrichment. Each projectile consisted of a lightweight aluminum body cast around a smaller caliber depleted uranium-penetrating core. The projectile weighed about 15 ounces and measured 4 inches in length. Depleted uranium possessed a density roughly 60% greater than lead. And when it struck armor at high velocity, it didn't mushroom or fragment like conventional rounds. Instead, it sharpened itself, the intense friction causing the material to self-sharpen as it penetrated, burning through steel like a plasma cutter. The kinetic energy alone, combined with the pyrophoric properties of the uranium, turned tank interiors into furnaces. Fragments of uranium penetrator, heated to thousands of degrees, burst into flames on contact with oxygen, igniting fuel and ammunition inside the target vehicle. The recoil force measured 10,000 pounds, roughly equal to the thrust of one of the A-10's 2 TF-34 turbofan engines. If mounted off-center, firing would spin the aircraft violently off course. So the American engineers placed the gun barrel exactly on the aircraft's centerline, with the firing barrel positioned at the 9 o'clock position when viewed from the front. The nose landing gear was offset to the starboard side to make room for the 7 barrels. The aircraft was literally designed around the gun, every other component subordinate to making this weapon work. It was a gun that flew, not a plane that carried a gun. But firepower alone didn't explain the impossible survival rate. Iraqi gunners were hitting these aircraft, sometimes repeatedly. The Shilkas were scoring direct hits. SA-13 missiles were finding their targets, their 5-pound warheads detonating on contact. So why weren't they falling? The answer, when the Soviets finally understood it, represented a philosophical divide they could never have crossed. The Americans had encased their pilots in 200 pounds of titanium armor. They called it the bathtub. And it was exactly that, a shell of titanium plates surrounding the cockpit and critical flight systems, varying in thickness from 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches, depending on likely trajectories and deflection angles. It was designed to withstand 23mm armor-piercing rounds and indirect hits from 57mm shell fragments. The armor made up almost 6% of the A-10's empty weight. Any interior surface directly exposed to the pilot was covered by a multi-layer nylon spall shield to protect against shell fragmentation. While Soviet designers obsessed over saving every possible gram to maximize speed and maneuverability, the Americans added 1/2 ton of armor and accepted the performance penalty. It was a medieval approach in the jet age. The concept of heavy armor protecting the night inside. But it worked. The redundancy went deeper. Far deeper than the Soviets initially understood. The A-10 had 3 independent hydraulic systems. If one failed, 2 remained. If 2 failed, the third could still fly the plane. If all 3 failed, steel cables connected the control stick directly to the flight surfaces. A pilot could literally wrestle the plane home using muscle power alone. cranking the control surfaces against the wind resistance like steering a truck without power steering. The engines sat high on the tail, widely separated, shielded from heat-seeking missiles by the horizontal stabilizers and fuselage. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with foam that expanded when punctured to prevent fuel leakage. The wings had honeycomb structures that could lose huge sections and still provide lift. The twin vertical stabilizers meant that if one was shot away, the other could maintain directional control. Every system had a backup. Every backup had a backup. The design philosophy was simple and brutal. Assume you will be hit, and build everything to keep flying after you're hit. On February 15, A-10 Warthog, Captain Kim Campbell proved the design philosophy over Baghdad. Her A-10 took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. The blast destroyed one engine and crippled the hydraulic system. The stabilizer was damaged. Flight controls were barely responsive. Warning lights filled the cockpit. Fuel and hydraulic fluid streamed from the damaged wing. By every reasonable metric, she should have ejected immediately. Instead, she switched to manual reversion and flew the crippled aircraft 300 miles back to base, wrestling with the controls the entire way. Every movement requiring physical force to overcome the wind resistance. She landed safely. Maintenance crews counted the damage and found themselves stunned. The aircraft flew again 5 days later after repairs. But the most terrifying revelation for the Soviets came when they analyzed the actual combat statistics. On February 25, A-10 Warthog, during the second day of the ground war, 2 A-10 pilots, Captain Eric Solomonson and Lieutenant John Marks from the 76th Tactical Fighter Squadron, were scrambled to intercept a large column of Iraqi tanks moving south from Republican Guard positions. The pilots arrived over Iraq at sunrise through a haze of smoke from burning oil wells. They were carrying infrared AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 174 rounds of 30mm ammunition. The Maverick missiles, which detect and home on heat sources, had unusually rich targets with the tank engines running hot in the cold desert dawn. It took 10 minutes for the pair to kill 6 tanks with Mavericks. 2 more fell to the brutal force of the 30mm cannon. Rather than return to their main base, the pilots landed at a forward operating location, refueled, rearmed, and took off again. By the end of that single day, those 2 pilots had destroyed 23 Iraqi tanks, 23 armored vehicles, each one costing millions, crewed by trained soldiers, supported by air defense systems, eliminated by 2 aircraft. The Wing Operations Center confirmed they had set an all-time record for combined Maverick and cannon kills. Captain Solomonson later described the mission with stark simplicity. "We're impressing a lot of people. We're coming in with more confirmed bomb damage than any other jet. We see the targets and know they are destroyed. We also only report the stuff we see blowing up or on fire. The other jets fly a lot faster, a lot higher, but don't drop nearly as much stuff. Nor can they hang out in the target area as long as we can." In Moscow, the final pieces of the puzzle arrived in late February. A Soviet intelligence officer placed a single object on the conference table during a high-level briefing: a 30mm depleted uranium shell recovered from the Kuwaiti desert. It was enormous, the size of a human forearm, weighing over a pound. The aluminum casing showed the distinctive marks of the rotating barrel mechanism. The depleted uranium core, partially exposed where the aluminum had abraded away during flight, gleamed dully in the fluorescent light. "They're firing these at 3. No sense rounds per minute," the officer said quietly. The room fell silent. The generals did the math. That was 65 rounds per second. In a 2-second burst, an A-10 could put 130 rounds into a target. That wasn't a strafing run. That was a laser beam of heavy metal, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through the thickest armor the Soviets had ever produced. Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, studied the shell and then looked at the map of the Middle East spread across the table. The Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles developing the MiG-29 and Su-27 to counter American speed and agility. They had spent decades perfecting S-300 missile systems to shoot down high-flying bombers. They had prepared for a war of speed, electronics, and altitude. They had not prepared for a brute, for something that combined World War II durability with modern precision firepower. "What is the effective range of this weapon?" Yazov asked. The intelligence officer consulted his notes. Approximately 4,000 feet for maximum accuracy. 80% of rounds fired at that range hit within a 40-foot circle. But pilots routinely engage from closer ranges, sometimes as close as 1,000 feet. One of the generals laughed bitterly. At 1,000 feet, every weapon we have should destroy them. The intelligence officer didn't laugh. They are being destroyed, Comrade Marshal. But they survive the destruction. They continue to fight after taking damage that would obliterate any aircraft in our inventory. The implications were devastating, and they rippled outward in concentric circles of catastrophe. The T-72, the backbone of Soviet armored doctrine, couldn't fight back effectively. Its 125mm main gun had an effective range against moving targets of roughly 800 meters. The A-10 could engage from beyond that distance with Maverick missiles, each one capable of destroying a tank with a single hit. And when the Warthog closed for the gun run, the tank crew had perhaps 15 seconds to score a killing hit on an armored target that seemed to absorb punishment the way a sponge absorbs water. The exchange rate was catastrophic, worse than the Soviets had initially calculated. During Operation Desert Storm, 8 seconds flew 100 combat sorties. They fired 783, 514 rounds of 30mm ammunition. They launched 5 000 AGM -6 Maverick missiles. The destruction they wrought was biblical. They destroyed 987 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 355 combat vehicles, and hundreds of other targets. They even shot down 2 Iraqi helicopters in air-to-air combat using the GAU-8 cannon, an almost comical demonstration of the weapon's versatility. The cost: 6 8 seconds lost to enemy fire, 6 aircraft for nearly 1,000 tanks and over 1,000 other armored vehicles. The ratio wasn't 1:1, which Soviet doctrine considered acceptable. It wasn't even 5:1. It was 165:1. For every Warthog brought down, an entire armored brigade was erased from existence. The Soviets had built their entire military strategy on acceptable loss ratios, on the assumption that their numerical superiority and industrial capacity could sustain higher casualties than their enemies. This wasn't acceptable. This was annihilation. This was genocide of armor. Iraqi prisoners told interrogators that the single most feared aircraft wasn't the supersonic F-16 with its precision bombs, or the invisible F-117 with its laser-guided munitions. It was the slow, ugly plane that circled overhead for hours, selecting targets with deliberate precision, immune to the weapons that were supposed to protect them. The sound became a psychological weapon more effective than any propaganda. Because the 30mm rounds traveled faster than sound, if you heard the burr, it meant you were alive. It meant the pilot had deliberately aimed somewhere else. The death was already past. The rounds already impacted. The tank already burning. But it also meant the Warthog was still circling overhead. And they could always make another pass. Some Iraqi units abandoned perfectly functional tanks rather than face another gun run. Republican Guard soldiers, veterans of 8 years of brutal combat against Iran, broke and fled at the sound of those twin engines. Officers found their men hiding in bunkers, refusing to man their vehicles, eyes wide with a terror that no amount of discipline could overcome. One Iraqi captain, captured on February 24, told American interrogators, "The jets that fly high, those are random death. If the bomb has your name on it, you die. If it doesn't, you live." But the A-10, that is personal. The pilot sees you. He chooses you. He circles and circles, and you know he is deciding whether to kill you or not. And when he decides, there is nothing you can do. The Soviet investigation concluded with a truth they couldn't speak aloud in official reports. They had prepared for the wrong war. They had built air defense systems to kill fast, fragile jets at high altitude. They had designed their tanks to fight other tanks in massive armored engagements across the plains of Germany. They had trained their armies to operate in a world where speed and numbers would overcome any technological advantage. The Americans sent something that flew low and slow, that absorbed their best punches and kept fighting, that combined World War II durability with space-age firepower and precision. The A-10 had exposed the fatal flaw in Soviet doctrine. Complexity was vulnerability. Speed required fragility. Sophisticated systems broke under stress. The Americans had built something brutally simple, a flying gun wrapped in so much redundancy and armor that it became nearly impossible to kill with the weapons the Soviets had designed and exported around the world. The economic impact rippled immediately through the Soviet military-industrial complex. Which nation would buy Soviet tanks now? Knowing they could be systematically dismantled by a plane the U.S. Air Force considered obsolete and had tried to retire? Who would trust Soviet air defense systems that couldn't bring down a subsonic attack aircraft flying in a straight line at low altitude? The phone lines to Rosoboronexport, the Soviet Arms Export Agency, went silent. Syria, Libya, North Korea watched the same satellite footage, saw the burning T-72 seconds on Highway 80, saw the Iraqi army surrendering in droves. The T-72, once the pride of Soviet engineering and a major export product, had become a symbol of obsolescence and vulnerability. The myth of Soviet military parity, carefully cultivated through decades of propaganda and selective intelligence leaks, crumbled in the desert sand of Kuwait and Iraq, killed by a design philosophy the Soviet system could never have produced. Their rigid, top-down hierarchy demanded conformity. If the General Secretary liked fast planes, everyone built fast planes. If the design bureau chief preferred sophisticated radar systems, everyone developed sophisticated radar systems. There was no room for a fighter mafia. No space for a group of rebels within the Pentagon to push through an ugly, slow, specialized aircraft that violated every contemporary principle of fighter design. In the Soviet system, the A-10 would have been canceled at the drawing board for being regressive, for looking backward instead of forward, for prioritizing survivability over performance metrics. The Americans, with their chaotic, competitive defense acquisition process, had somehow stumbled into building exactly the right weapon for a war the Soviets thought they understood. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. Less than a year after Desert Storm, multiple factors contributed to that collapse. But the military humiliation played its role. The revelation that their weapons, their doctrine, their entire military-industrial complex couldn't compete with American technology, shattered the last vestiges of confidence in the Soviet system. In the years following Desert Storm, as the Russian Federation emerged from the ashes of the USSR, the lessons of the A-10 forced a radical redesign of their armor warfare doctrine. The modern Russian T-90 tanks and T-14 Armata tanks are covered in reactive armor and active protection systems. Desperate attempts to stop the kind of kinetic penetrators the GAU-8 fires, they spent the next 30 years trying to armor their tanks against a plane that was designed in 1972 and first flew in 1975. A plane that the U.S. Air Force still, to this day, tries repeatedly to retire. The Air Force brass calls it too old, too slow, unable to survive in a world of advanced surface-to-air missiles and sophisticated radar systems. They want to replace it with the sleek F-35, with its stealth capabilities and networked sensors and multi-role versatility. But every time combat starts, every time American troops find themselves in contact with enemy forces, the call goes out: send the Warthog. In Afghanistan, flying close air support for troops in mountain valleys, the A-10 proved irreplaceable. In Iraq, again during the fight against ISIS, the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 became a morale booster for Iraqi forces and a terror weapon against insurgents. In Syria, operating in contested airspace, the A-10 continued to demonstrate its value. The soldiers on the ground don't ask for the invisible jet that flies at 40,000 feet. They don't ask for the sophisticated multi-role fighter with its suite of sensors. They ask for the ugly machine that flies low enough to see the targets, that circles overhead for hours, that can put ordnance exactly where it's needed, and that keeps flying even when the enemy fights back. The ghost over the desert never stopped flying. Today, over 30 years after Desert Storm, approximately 280 A-10 seconds remain in active service with the U.S. Air Force. They've been upgraded with better avionics, modern targeting pods, precision-guided munitions capability, and improved communications systems. But the core design remains unchanged: the titanium bathtub, the redundant systems, the manual reversion capability, and that massive gun. The A-10C variant can integrate with modern battlefield networks, share targeting data with drones and ground forces, employ precision weapons that didn't exist in 1991. But when the mission calls for close air support, when American lives depend on putting steel on target with absolute certainty, the solution remains the same: ugly, slow, brutally effective aircraft that shattered Soviet military doctrine in the Kuwaiti desert. And for those who faced it once, for the Iraqi tank crews who survived to tell the tale, for the Soviet observers who watched their doctrine crumble, the nightmare has never truly ended. They still hear that sound, that distinctive brrr that means death is circling overhead. They still see the cross-shaped silhouette emerging from the smoke, slow and deliberate, ignoring the tracers reaching up toward it, selecting its next target with the patience of a hunting hawk. The lesson written in the sand and steel of Desert Storm remains clear and terrible: in the brutal arithmetic of combat. Sophistication is no substitute for survivability. And sometimes, the winner is the one willing to build something simple, durable, and ruthlessly effective at its one designated purpose. The Soviets built an empire on the assumption that quantity, doctrine, and ideological purity would overcome any obstacle. The A-10 Warthog proved that one well-designed machine, flown by skilled pilots willing to fly into hell itself, could shatter that assumption completely and irrevocably.